Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us Dr. Pronab Sen, who recently took over as chairman of the National Statistical Commission, a body which collects and collates masses of data on India's economy and really tells us how the Indian economy is transforming itself and has been doing it over the last decade and a half, 2 decades. Welcome to our show, Dr. Pronab Sen. To begin with, why don't you just tell us what is the mandate of the National Statistical Commission, which is not a very old body, formed some time ago with the idea of reviewing the existing systems for collecting and collating data?
Well, let me begin. The commission is now about 6 years old, a little over 6 years old. And the reason it was brought into existence by the government was that in our country, the statistical system follows the general governance system laid down by the Constitution. So what we have is a highly decentralized statistical system. In the central government alone, besides the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, there are 32 ministries and departments which undertake detailed statistical activity. Now, and then you have the states. So in such a decentralized system, you need some kind of a mechanism to do two things. One is to make sure that there isn't excessive duplication happening. So you have different agencies doing the same thing over and over again. Number two, to assure the people at large that the data that's being collected, collated, and then put out in the public domain adheres to certain minimum standards of quality. The third is to convince the public that the statistical system is not compromised through political interference. So the commission itself is really at an arm's length from the government. We report only to the parliament.
Okay, you report only to the parliament. Okay, and would you say that at the heart of the data that you look at is the census data?
Well, it's not the heart. Basically all data collection ultimately rests upon having some notion of what the overall complete economy and the system is.
Okay.
Now, what the census gives you is a complete enumeration of all households in the country, which makes a very valuable source for drawing samples. But in addition to this, we need additional information in terms of economic enterprises. And this we do through an economic census, which is currently in the field.
Is it correct that the National Statistical Commission, in its present form, actually came up more recently? You're right, 6 years ago, there was an initial standing committee was set up as a one-time reviewing system, right? Now, a permanent National Statistical Commission is a more recent occurrence, and is it true that it has come up in response to a lot of criticism from various quarters that in our newly transformed economy, post-liberalization economy, a lot of outdated methods were being used to collate data, whether it's on industrial production, whether it's on inflation, whether it's on household poverty, etc. Now, is this partly a response to all those criticisms?
No, the main reason, from what I can gather, is not so much that the data was being questioned. It was mainly because that what had happened after liberalization is that the stakeholders in the statistical sphere had widened. Prior to 91, as far as the statistical system is concerned, it considered only the government as its consumer. Post 91, the number of consumers has increased dramatically. So every corporation.
So did producers, number of.
Well, that came a little later.
Okay.
Basically, it started off first with all the manufacturers, the producers. Private sector became a major consumer of data. Then came the NGO sector, the civil society, who used the official statistics for their purposes. Now, given that the the number of stakeholders has increased, we really needed an agency which would give confidence to all the stakeholders that they were getting exactly the same data that the government was getting, and that the government was not tampering with that data to actually send a propaganda signal, as it were. Yeah. And that's why the NSC was brought into existence.
Okay. Now, which are the areas do you think, now that you're head of the commission, what would be your priorities in terms of the areas where you would like to address immediately in terms of, reviewing the existing system, statistical system, in order to give a better picture of what's going on to put out in the public space? Yeah.
Well, let me begin with the first and the most important is transparency.
Transparency, yeah. Okay.
The statistical system is, I think, in a very important sense, it's opaque. We have a lot of data that the government collects and government agencies collect and put out in the public domain, but how the data is collected and what are the limitations of the data, how the data should be interpreted, all of this is pretty much left up to your imagination. Okay? So transparency is, I think, the number one focus as far as we are concerned at this stage. Once we've got that, I believe the level of dialogue between the larger community of users and the statistical system will improve. Okay, so the first step as far as we are concerned is to bring out a national policy on statistics, okay, which basically lays down that for every producer of official statistics, what are the do's and don'ts that have to be adhered to.
So everybody would follow a set of guidelines?
Of principles.
Principles, okay.
It's really principles.
Okay, okay.
Okay? Having done that, then you start putting more flesh. That's a skeleton, which everybody has to follow. Then you start putting more flesh on it in terms of details as to how you do it, what should be the nature of the documentation, what should be the way the documentation is conveyed to the public. So all of that will come. But basically it is that we have an extensive statistical system to remove the opacity that exists today. Yeah. That's the number one priority.
Okay. Now this would also, I assume, this would include making more transparent and more easy the questionnaires that you that the national NSSO sample surveys put out to people. I believe that those questionnaires have some 40-50 questions which are very complicated and difficult for people to actually reply in terms of what they consume, their habits, their economic habits, etc. Will this involve changes at that end?
Well, this has been something which has been under discussion now for 20 years. Okay? It's nothing new. The point is that every time you change a questionnaire, you actually affect the comparability of the data with the past data. Right? So from the academic community with whom we have fairly close links.
So you have to be very careful. You have to be careful.
You have to be very careful that you don't do something where you suddenly find that you're comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah, comparability. Yeah.
Comparability is absolutely essential for you to do any analytical work.
Sure, yeah. So we'll take a small break here. Please don't go away and keep watching Rajya television. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Dr. Pronab Sen, Chairman of National Statistical Commission. Dr. Pronab, you were saying that a whole lot of change is under discussion. Now, it might take some time. Now, in the meanwhile, let us discuss some of the variables of the Indian economy as they are evolving. Now, where do you see the growth in industrial recovery or GDP as envisaged in the budget in February? It was said that this year we could come back to 6% plus growth if investments, pipeline investments fructify, and a hope has been expressed that inflation will also settle back down at about 5.5% average. Now, at least the inflation number is proving to be a big relief, considering it was so sticky right through 2011, 2012. Now, where do you see these variables heading?
Well, it's actually quite clear what's happening. Right? First of all, I think we need to know that even today, even under the depressed circumstances that we are talking about, we still have more than 30% of GDP as investment. Yeah. Okay, most countries would be delighted to have those kinds of numbers.
We would be among the, say, top 5 savings rate in the world
And investment rates.
and investment rates
And
in the world.
investment rates. Okay, so investment per se is not so much the issue. Right? What is really the issue is that we have had a very serious slowdown in corporate investment.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, corporate India, in our estimate, has reduced its investment rate by almost 6% of GDP. Okay, which is huge. And that's really the difference.
By 6% of GDP?
By 6% of GDP. Okay.
Why do you think they have reduced the investment?
Well, that's difficult to say, but I think that there are several reasons for it.
So you're saying that the bulk of the reduction in investment rate has come from the corporate side?
Yes, that's correct. And there's some from the government side. Yeah. So the total compression is basically corporate. It's non-corporate, non-government India, which is basically your SME sector, which is really investing.
Why do you call SMEs non-corporate? Won't they be
Well,
corporate?
part of them are corporate, but
They're not organized corporations. Okay.
you see, basically they have to be registered under the Companies Act to be considered corporates. Okay, if you're basically registered usually it's a proprietorship or a partnership, the bulk of the companies.
Sure. Which is why recently you had emphasized on SME investments in one of your interviews.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
In fact, that's the hidden story in India. That the core below which I think the country almost never goes, which is about 4.5% of GDP, is essentially based on investment by the SMEs.
Sure.
It's what you get above that where the corporates really start kicking in.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I think one of the main reasons for corporate investment slowing down is the fact that public investment in infrastructure has actually slowed down fairly dramatically over the last 2 years.
Okay.
All right. But not all kinds. So you've got, for instance, the Gram Sadak Yojana, which is doing very, very well. But on the other hand, you've got the NHAI program, which is in doldrums. You've got the power sector, which had been doing extremely well for the previous 4 years, running up against the fuel linkage problem. So today we have 15,000 megawatts of power capacity, which is simply sitting there waiting for the fuel linkage to happen. And under those circumstances, you're not going to find anybody new coming into the power sector because of this overhang of large capacities. And the third, of course, is the state of the global economy. Large corporate investments require them to tap into the global economy. And if you don't have confidence that the global economy is going to be able to support you, then you're not going to take the risk. And number 4.
You think that confidence is a bit shaky these days?
Confidence is shaky.
If one goes by 2 recent events, if I may say so, the big investments which came into India's leading aviation airlines, Jet Airways, another big one, Unilever investing in upping its stake in Hindustan Lever, one FMCG company, consumer company, one airlines. It seemed to suggest that there are a lot of great assets lying in India which foreigners may want to buy. No?
Oh yes. So they are basically buying into existing assets.
Yeah.
The question is, do you have the confidence to create a new asset to address a demand that's going to be out there in the future, not the demand that exists today?
Okay.
That is the $1 million question. Right? And the third thing, I think, we've been caught up in this whole inflation thing.
Yeah.
But you do realize that as far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, which other than infrastructure investment is the second largest sector in which investment takes place, for the corporate manufacturing sector, the real interest rates today are absurdly high. And they've been high now for the last several months.
Sure, and this hurts the SMEs even more, right?
Well, it doesn't per se. Basically the bulk of SMEs, they don't get more than about 25% of their fund requirements from the bank.
I've said
that before. And to the best of my understanding, if you look at the banking data, there's been a very distinct slowdown in banking deposits. All right? Now, part of that is clearly going into gold. But I suspect a large part of it is going into the unregulated financial market, which is where the SMEs draw their funds from. Right? So I don't think it's quite as bad. They're accessing high-cost funds, so it makes them more vulnerable. But I don't think it's really affected the.
So Pranab, you're suggesting that RBI has been very slow in dropping interest rates at a desired pace, which the industry might require. And one of the criticisms against the RBI is that monetary policy necessarily has to be anticipatory. You have to anticipate and can't wait for an event to happen and then take action. So this time around, inflation has fallen dramatically, and the governor then considered, yes, inflation has fallen. Now, perhaps we can go for a big cut. Shouldn't this have been before rather than after?
Well, this is the thing. A lot of it depends upon the way you see the effect of a monetary policy playing out. Okay, the so-called transmission mechanism. We are actually in a very strange situation. We are not in a regular, well-defined business cycle where these things are predictable. We've been through a series of wrenching discontinuities, starting with the global crisis and then the famine, the drought that we had in 2009. And so we've been through all these discontinuities. So it's very difficult for anybody to predict what the future is going to be and therefore be ahead of it.
Can't the Commission, this reminds me, something very interesting you said. The West has had a history of business cycles. So far easier to go back into history and then project the future. Now, India, we've really started having business cycles post-liberalization and post-greater integration with the rest of the world. Now, we've had two business cycles. One, if you remember, that 97.
We have basically had a business cycle which was 97 to 2007. Then you got the Great Crash.
Great Crash,
okay?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So the next business cycle which we are due to enter got aborted.
Okay.
Okay. So as far as our understanding of business cycles is concerned, we have only one experience.
Okay.
Just a single one.
Okay. This is very interesting, but we'll come back to this after a small break. Please don't go away and keep watching RSTV. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Dr. Pronab Sen, Chairman of National Statistical Commission. Dr. Pronab, we were discussing business cycles. Now, it's very interesting that you said that post-reforms we've had only one business cycle, and probably we are into the second one now. We're probably at the trough. You don't know when the recovery will. Now, as National Statistical Commission, I'm sure you would also be seized of a method on how to read business cycles also, in terms of, how do you do this? Even as an anticipatory kind of exercise, how do you do it?
We don't. Venu, let's be very clear on this. Okay, the job of the statistical system is to provide the data. Okay, the analytical work, which is all this business cycle stuff, is that of somebody else. Okay, it's the Planning Commission, the Finance Ministry, the RBI. They are supposed to have the analytical apparatus to be able to take the data that we provide, and then make sense out of it.
Yeah, but they would surely coordinate with you on that, right?
No, they would in terms of the data, but it is a very dangerous thing for the data producer to do analytical work, because that then influences the way the data is collected and presented. So we try and insulate the statistical system from actually doing anything which is analytical. We do a lot of descriptive stuff, which is what what the data is telling you, but not the analytical.
Yeah. What I was getting at was, suppose Planning Commission or Finance Ministry decides to study business cycle. Now, for that, they will come to you, and if they come up with a framework, then at least for that you'll have to provide data. So for that, you may have to find new ways of collecting data in order to feed the analytical. The people who are analyzing it, is that?
No, that's exactly how it goes. Statistical data is always the outcome of a demand from a particular user. Okay. So today, if you really look at the statistical system in India, especially in the center, it was initially driven by the planning system. So it was the planning system which laid down what was the data they needed to make the plan models work. And the statistical system then provided that information. Okay, so as the user community starts placing demands on the statistical system, it responds and provides that data if possible. Okay, what we also do is that because statistical data collection is extremely expensive, and mind you, this people tend to forget, they think it's free. we have to be very careful about the cost benefit.
Cost benefit.
So there are all sorts of people who come and say, why don't you give us this data? And what we have to do is to say that given the resources that we have, do I produce this data for you or some other data for somebody else?
Somebody else, yeah.
So, I mean, that's a call we have to take.
Okay. And, in regard to business cycle, Pronab, is the government, has the government ever demanded from you, the Finance Ministry or Planning Commission, data to study whether a downward business cycle, how much is it due to global factors and how much is it due to domestic factors? Because this is an ongoing debate. Like India has lost about 4% of its peak GDP. So has China. Brazil has lost about 5% of its peak. They were 7%, now they're 2%. Now, how much is it? There's an ongoing debate whether this is 60% global, 40 local, or some people say it's 80% domestic, only 20%. How do we assess how much is it due to?
Well, again, as I said, that really depends upon the nature of the analytical modeling that you're doing. All right. In the Indian case, frankly, the global economy is not very well integrated in our models. Okay. So as far as the global economy is concerned, it's really a small little add-on to the larger domestic models that we use.
Is that so? Because 40% of our total trade is about 40% of our GDP, isn't it? If
Yeah, but that's, that again is something which is a little misleading. All right, because when you're talking about trade, you're talking about the total value of the product.
If you take value add,
you take value add, you just divide it by 3, so that 40% actually becomes 12%.
But I've been told, Pranab, that even in case of China, if you take value add, their total volume, it gets 40% gets knocked off in their case also.
No, it does. Because basically, typically in these kinds of products, the value add is only normally about somewhere between 20 to 30%.
Yeah. Like in gems and jewelry is only 10%. Yeah.
Gems, so on the average it's about 20 to 30%.
Okay. So to that extent, we are not that integrated. Yeah.
Well, we are a lot more integrated than we were before. When it used to be 12-14%, which is now 40%. So we are a lot more integrated.
Yeah. And Pranab, you look at data very closely. Can you tell us in some 3-4 very critical ways in which our economic structure is changing? For instance, one debate which one has been reading in the papers, also hearing experts talk about, is this current account deficit. Are we structurally on a much higher current account deficit? Is our exports not growing at the rate they should be? Are we less competitive? And our imports are permanently on a higher I mean, how do you look at some of the structural aspects?
You see, as far as current account deficits are concerned, there are 2 dimensions. One is that in the short run, the current account deficit is in fact driven by your export and import behavior, right? But in the longer run, it's really driven by your investment savings behavior. So if you look at a current account deficit, it has been in the 4+ range now for an extended period of time. It's not 2 months.
2 years.
It's almost 2 years now. What that suggests is we are not really talking about imports and exports per se. What we are really talking about is our investment savings gap.
Okay, the gap.
It's the gap. So you're basically talking about 4% excess investment over savings, right?
So they need to increase savings.
So basically the problem is on the savings side. And so you really need to look at what's going on out there. Now, some of that story we already know. And the main contributor to all of this is the government itself, where we've gone from a positive government savings to now a fairly substantial negative government savings.
Plus gold?
Well, gold is the second part of the story, which is that as far as households are concerned, that savings, but it doesn't get counted as investment because it's not productive. All right?
Sure.
So you have to actually deduct that from savings.
Yeah, but some economists argue that gold should be treated as an asset. Why should it be treated as a consumption item?
No, it is.
For the purpose of current.
It is. But assets with whom? It's assets with
like with households? Yeah.
It's assets with households.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
But non-monetized.
It is not it's not a productive asset. Exactly. That it does not create capacity to produce goods and services.
Sure.
It creates capacity for consumption.
Maybe future consumption.
Future consumption,
Yeah.
but not for future production.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a very important distinction.
But can something policy be evolved brought to make it immediately productive? Some sort of gold bond scheme, or so that the gold held by households actually come out and come into the banking stream.
Look, got to be a little careful on this. The problem that occurs is that when the household buys gold, in the Indian context, it is buying new gold imported into India. So the resource is actually getting transferred abroad.
Transfer. Yeah. Sure.
It's not staying here.
Yeah.
But gold transactions is really just a change in asset position.
Asset position. Yeah.
All right. So it really doesn't make any difference. It doesn't increase your savings or investment in any sense.
So the only solution then is to discourage import of gold
Well,
for consumption.
It's not discourage. It is to persuade households that there are better assets in which to put them.
I guess when growth recovery happens, equity prices go up. Equity becomes more attractive. It will automatically move towards.
This is precisely the thing.
Yeah.
Look at what the consumer is facing. We've been running more than 10% plus consumer price inflation now for 3 years. Right? You have the bank deposits fetching a maximum of 9%, which means you got a 1% negative interest rate. The stock market was in complete doldrums until 4 months ago.
Yeah, sure.
So it didn't look particularly attractive either, right? Real estate market has been in doldrums ever since the crash.
Although in regional markets are
The regional markets are okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So what were they left with in terms of what they could put their money into?
Sure. They had no other avenue.
Right?
Yeah.
So really at the heart of it is the consumer price inflation,
Yeah,
which is turning every asset into a negative yield.
So basically, what you're saying that we need growth to pick up and inflation to subside and things.
Not just any inflation, consumer price inflation.
Yeah, and then things will be back to normal.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Sen. Yeah, pleasure. That's all we have in this episode of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you again soon. Thanks for watching.